The place where she arrived had been expecting departures longer than it could remember arrivals, and the land carried that habit quietly. The town sat where the rail line thinned, and the road gave up trying to be straight, a shallow bowl of ground pressed between low rises that blocked wind unevenly. To the east, the tracks ran on toward places people spoke of with certainty. To the west, they faded into scrub and distance, serving mostly as proof that leaving was possible, not that it would be easy. The earth there was packed hard by years of boots, hooves, and wheels that paused only briefly before moving on, leaving behind dust that settled into every crack. Buildings leaned slightly, not from damage, but from age and acceptance, wood swelling and shrinking with seasons that were never kind enough to settle. In summer, the heat lingered close to the ground, bending the air above the street so that things looked farther away than they were. In winter, the cold cut clean, finding gaps in walls and fences without effort, making stillness feel deliberate. The land remembered waiting more than movement. It remembered trains that came late, supplies that did not come at all, and letters read until the paper softened and tore. Wind passed through town without greeting, rattling loose signs, lifting grit, then moving on as if it had other places to be. Nothing in the layout suggested welcome. Nothing suggested refusal either. It was a place shaped by use, not invitation. Beyond the last house, fields spread thin and stubborn, marked by fence lines that did not always agree with the ground beneath them. Some posts stood straight. Others leaned, held upright only by tension and habit. Grass grew where it could, shorter near paths, longer where feet rarely went. In the evenings, sound traveled oddly. A door closing at one end of town might be heard clearly at the other, while voices spoken nearby dissolved into nothing. At night the land dimmed unevenly, darkness pooling in corners, along the edges of buildings, under wagons left too long. The sky above was wide and indifferent, offering stars without warmth, clouds without promise. Rain, when it came, arrived suddenly and left just as quickly, carving shallow channels in the street that filled and vanished, leaving the surface harder than before. The land took note of who stayed and who did not, though it did not judge either. It simply held their marks until time pressed them flat. Suitcases had rested on the platform before, their shapes leaving lighter patches in the dust. Boots had stood still while decisions were made, their outlines blurred by wind within hours. The ground near the station was a map of hesitation, crossed and recrossed until no single direction stood out. People spoke of opportunity elsewhere, but the land itself offered no such language. It offered continuity. It offered the weight of remaining. Morning light revealed everything plainly, without softness, showing chipped paint, uneven boards, and the long view down the track that made distance feel permanent. Evening brought no concealment, only shadow placed carefully by angles the sun had learned over years. The land had watched women arrive before, watched them pause, watched them leave again, and it had watched some stay long enough to become part of the background, noticed only when absent. It did not prepare itself for change. It did not resist it. It simply remained, holding space for expectation, for endurance, for whatever choice would eventually settle into its soil and be carried forward as memory. She was noticed before she was known, the way newcomers often are in places where routine has been worn thin. People saw her first as a shape moving from the platform toward the boarding house, a small figure carrying what little could be carried without help. Her dress marked her as recent, not fine, not poor, simply unfamiliar in its cut and color, the fabric unsoftened by local dust. She walked carefully, not timidly, but with the attention of someone who understood that ground could change without warning. Those watching did not approach. They rarely did. Observation came easier than welcome. By the second day, most knew what to call her, though not by name. She was the mail-order bride, spoken of in the same tone used for freight that arrived late, or tools ordered, sight unseen. Men looked once, then away, uncertain where curiosity might lead. Women measured her longer, not unkindly, but with the habit of comparison that life in close quarters encourages. She rented a narrow room and kept its door closed except when passing through, neither inviting company nor signaling refusal. Each morning she stepped into town as if she had always done so, buying what was needed, asking few questions, listening more than speaking. Her accent, when it appeared, placed her somewhere else, though no one pressed to know where. People said she had come for a husband who had written steadily, then less so, then not at all. They said he had land, or intended to, or had lost it already. None of this was confirmed. She did not offer correction. When spoken to directly, she answered plainly, without explanation, as if explanation belonged to another stage of life. She took work where it was available, mending, cooking, cleaning, her hands quick and competent, movements economical. Those who paid her noticed she did not linger once a task was done. She returned to her room before talk could gather. Children followed her at a distance at first, curious about someone who did not belong to any household yet. She did not encourage them, but she did not send them away either, and so they learned the edge of her presence without instruction. In the evenings, she walked beyond the last buildings, stopping where the ground opened and the town loosened its hold. She stood there often, not looking back toward the platform, not looking ahead either, simply facing the spread of land that offered no advice. People assumed she was waiting to leave. It was the sensible conclusion. Brides who arrived under such arrangements did not always remain. Sometimes they left quietly, sometimes suddenly. Their absence explained away without detail. Expectation settled around her like a second garment. It shaped how questions were asked, how offers were made, how long anyone bothered to remember her preferences. Even kindness carried an edge of temporary concern, as if investment required assurance of permanence. She seemed aware of this without responding to it. Her posture did not suggest gratitude or resentment. It suggested containment. Those who thought they saw disappointment in her mistook stillness for loss. Others believed they detected resolve, though they could not have said why. The truth, if there was one, did not announce itself. She moved through the town as someone passing through a season rather than a place, attentive, deliberate, leaving little behind except the fact of her presence. The land took note of her weight, light as it was, the way it took note of all who crossed it, without deciding what it meant. The moment itself did not stand apart from the day that carried it, and for a time she did not recognize it as a choice at all. It arrived in pieces, fitted together by habit and restraint, shaped by what had already been assumed of her. The letter had been folded too many times, its creases soft, its ink thinned where fingers had worried it, and she had stopped reading it months earlier, knowing its shape by touch alone. The house she had been meant to enter remained unopened to her, its windows reflecting the street without offering view inside, its door holding steady under a lock that answered no knock she would give. People spoke around the absence without naming it, and their glances suggested a solution that required her movement rather than theirs. Leaving would have been simple in practice. The track ran east with certainty. Yet the platform offered schedules. The town understood departures well enough to make room for them. Staying required a different kind of accounting. It meant accepting the position she had already been placed in, the quiet scrutiny, the conditional help, the way expectation leaned toward her without touching. She felt this most clearly in small moments that carried weight beyond themselves. A pause before a shopkeeper reached for goods, the way a hand withdrew when an offer might have implied commitment, the manner in which directions were given as if she were already halfway gone. The choice lay between motion and endurance, neither clean, neither promising relief. She stood one afternoon at the edge of town where the ground opened and the noise fell away, the rail line stretching out until it lost its shine. When the road, lifting toward scrub and distance. Wind moved across the fields without favor, flattening grass and lifting it again, indifferent to which way she faced. She considered how often movement had been mistaken for courage, and how often staying had been mistaken for weakness, and how neither interpretation held much truth. The land offered no signal. It did not warm or chill in response. It simply waited, as it always did, holding the space between decisions without comment. She noticed then how her body answered the thought of leaving with a tightening that had nothing to do with fear, a sense of being unmoored before she had even stepped away. The thought of staying brought no comfort either, only a steadiness that asked to be carried day after day without recognition. As she weighed what could be endured quietly against what would require explanation later. She knew that leaving would allow the town to settle back into its habits without her. Her absence folded neatly into the category of what was expected. Staying would keep questions alive longer, would press against the assumption that arrangements resolved themselves if given time. The choice did not promise improvement. It promised only alignment with something she recognized in herself, a refusal to be moved simply because movement had been anticipated. As the afternoon thinned, she turned back toward the buildings, without marking the turn as final. She did not announce it to herself. She did not seek confirmation from anyone else. The decision took shape in ordinary actions. The way she paid for another week in her room, the way she accepted work without asking how long it might last, the way she stopped counting days by the rail schedule. There was no moment of resolve that could be pointed to later. The choice was quiet, because it needed to be. It did not ask for witness. It did not require defense. It settled into her like a posture learned slowly, held without strain, maintained because release would have cost more than endurance. When evening came, she did not stand at the platform. She walked instead beyond the last houses and watched light fall across ground that offered no path marked for her, and she remained there until the shadows lengthened, not waiting for a sign, not rehearsing departure, simply allowing the decision to exist without explanation, trusting that time would reveal its weight without her needing to name it. Time changed character after that, not by speeding or slowing, but by loosening its edges so that days no longer stood apart cleanly. Waiting became the dominant condition, settling over the town and over her place within it, without announcement. Nothing urgent followed her decision to remain. No confrontation arrived to test it. The rail schedule continued to be posted and replaced, numbers changing while meaning stayed the same. She rose each morning and went about her work with the same care she had learned elsewhere, measuring flour, counting stitches, finishing what had been asked without asking for more. People adjusted gradually, though not decisively. Some stopped asking how long she planned to stay. Others continued to ask in different ways, by offering directions unneeded, by pausing before saying her name, by leaving space in conversation, as if an answer might still appear. Waiting revealed itself most clearly in the land. The street wore deeper grooves where wagons passed, then softened again after rain. A fence near the edge of town was mended poorly, and left that way, its crooked line accepted because no one expected it to last. The seasons turned without emphasis. Heat gave way to dust, dust to wind, wind to cold, that settled into walls and joints alike. She noticed how the town held itself between expectation and fatigue, how effort was spent only where habit demanded it. Her own waiting took shape in small adjustments. She learned which hours were quietest, which shops asked the fewest questions, which paths avoided unnecessary attention. In the evenings, she still walked beyond the last buildings, not to consider leaving, but to allow the day to fall away without being examined. There were moments when she felt the weight of her choice most strongly, not as doubt, but as persistence. Staying required repetition. It required answering the same looks, with the same calm, carrying uncertainty without resolving it for others. Waiting did not reward her with belonging. It tested her capacity to remain without reward. At times, she sensed impatience in the town, not directed at her, but at the unresolved nature of her presence. Things were expected to conclude themselves. People were expected to move on. Her stillness resisted that expectation without confronting it. The land mirrored this unease quietly. Storms came and passed without damage worth noting. Crops grew unevenly. Some rose strong, others thin. The difference accepted without comment. A dog began sleeping under her window at night, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. No reason was given. Waiting allowed such changes without explanation. Weeks passed, then more. Winter approached without ceremony, bringing a clarity that stripped the valley of softness. Cold revealed what had been hidden, sharpened outlines, made movement deliberate. She continued as before, her days defined less by hope than by continuity. Waiting did not mean inaction. It meant endurance without promise. She understood that staying had not solved anything. It had only committed her to remain present for whatever unfolded next, whether recognition came or not. In that sense, waiting became the true cost of her choice. It asked her to hold space without knowing what would fill it, to accept time as something lived rather than anticipated. When snow finally came, light and brief, covering the ground just enough to show every mark left behind, she watched it melt by afternoon, leaving the street harder than before. Waiting had done the same to her. It had pressed her decision into the shape of her days, making it less visible, more durable. By the time the cold settled in fully, there was no question left to answer aloud. She had stayed. The waiting had confirmed it not by event, but by accumulation, by the steady passing of time that did not push her away. The cost of her staying did not announce itself as loss, nor did it arrive in a shape that could be pointed to and named. It settled slowly, threading itself through ordinary days until it became difficult to remember when it had first begun. Work continued to come her way, but it changed in quality, not in amount. Tasks that required trust were offered later, after pause, after consideration. She was paid fairly, though rarely promptly, as if delay itself were a form of caution. Invitations did not extend beyond usefulness. She was welcome where hands were needed, less so where decisions were made. This was not cruelty. It was adjustment. The town learned how to place her without rewriting its expectations entirely. Her presence disrupted nothing openly, but it altered small balances. A woman who might have been temporary had proven otherwise, and the town did not know what to do with permanence that arrived without permission. She felt this most clearly in moments that should have been neutral. When disputes arose, her opinion was not sought, though she was often nearby. When plans were discussed, they were shaped as if she would hear, but not carry them forward. Her staying had not earned authority. It had only removed the convenience of her absence. The land reflected this consequence without emphasis. The paths she walked wore deeper, but no one remarked on them. Her house took on the marks of occupation: smoke darkening the eaves, boards wearing smooth at the threshold. Yet it was never spoken of as a home others might enter freely. Belonging did not arrive as comfort. It arrived as expectation. She was expected to endure weather without complaint, to take on work without question, to remain steady when others faltered. Her quiet became a resource others relied upon without acknowledging. In times of strain, she was looked to as someone who would not leave, and that knowledge carried weight. Staying had bound her to the town's failures as much as its continuities. When shortages came, she shared without ceremony. When illness passed through, she tended where needed, not singled out, not thanked beyond necessity. Her consequence was usefulness without voice. She did not resist it. Resistance would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have undone the very stillness that had allowed her to remain. Yet there were moments when the cost pressed harder. A man once spoke of her in her presence as if she were not there, referring to her staying as if it were proof of something lacking. She did not respond. The remark stayed with her longer than she expected, not because it wounded, but because it revealed how her choice had been interpreted without her consent. Staying had been read not as resolve, but as limitation. She carried that understanding quietly, adjusting her posture rather than her path. Over time, consequence reshaped her days into something narrower and more defined. She learned where she was expected and where she was merely tolerated. She learned how to occupy space without inviting claim. The land, indifferent to interpretation, continued to hold her steps as it held all others. Grass grew back where it had been pressed. Fences leaned further. The town did not punish her. It did not reward her. It absorbed her unevenly, leaving her changed without declaring her so. That was the consequence of her choice. Not exile, not belonging, but a settled position within a place that had not planned for her permanence, and now could not undo it. In later years, when the town spoke of that period at all, it was never as a turning point, only as something that had slowly taken its place among other remembered seasons. People said she stayed, as if staying were a simple fact, like weather recorded in a ledger. They did not say why. They did not say how long it had taken before her presence no longer felt provisional. Memory worked differently than expectation had. It did not preserve the tension, only the outcome softened by time. The land held it more faithfully. Paths she walked became worn enough to be noticed, then ordinary enough to be overlooked. Her steps pressed into the ground until they belonged to it, indistinguishable from those who had never planned to leave. The house she eventually occupied did not announce permanence. It aged quietly, boards settling, the roof sagging slightly, its position on the street accepted without remark. Children who had once followed her at a distance grew up knowing her, simply as someone who had always been there. They carried errands to her door without curiosity, receiving instructions without surprise. To them, her staying required no explanation. The past did not trouble them. For those older, memory arranged itself carefully. They remembered expecting her departure more clearly than they remembered her arrival. They remembered the gap where resolution should have been, the way her continued presence had stretched that gap until it no longer demanded attention. Over time, her story was told without detail, shaped by what could be held comfortably. She was the bride who did not leave, the woman who remained, the one who chose differently than expected. None of these versions captured the weight of the waiting, or the way time had asked for endurance rather than decision. She did not correct them. Correction would have required explanation, and explanation would have turned memory into argument. Instead, she allowed the story to pass as it would, trimmed of discomfort, rounded at the edges. The land accepted this version too. Seasons continued their work. Drought came and went. Rail traffic thinned, then thickened again. Buildings were repaired, then replaced. Through it all, her presence stayed constant enough to fade into the background of daily life. She was consulted on practical matters, trusted with keys, left alone without concern. Belonging arrived not as welcome, but as familiarity. Near the end of her life, when her movement slowed and her work was taken up by others, she spent more time sitting outside, watching light change across the same ground she had first walked as a stranger. Those who sat with her did not ask about the past. They spoke of weather, of small repairs needed, of who might pass through next. If she thought of the platform and the track beyond it, she did not show it. Memory did not pull her backward. It settled around her, quiet and complete in its own way. After she died, her things were divided without ceremony. What could be used was kept. What could not was discarded. Someone mentioned in passing that she had once been expected to leave. The remark did not linger. The town had no use for that expectation anymore. The land continued as it always had, holding traces until time pressed them flat. If her story was told later, it was told simply, without emphasis. A mail order bride came, she stayed. That was enough. This is how it was remembered.